Yeah, and that's another thing that I've noodled on several different occasions and had conversations with biotech builders about is sort of that, the critical stages of development, data generation, aligning with your key leadership hires. In your experience, is there sort of a general playbook in terms of the cadence at which cadence in order, right? Cadence and order of hires. We kind of talked about cadence. Cadence is a cash dependent thing. But if I'm starting out as a biotech builder, I've never done this before. Is there a general rule? Like, well, the first thing I need is a chief scientific officer. The next person I'm probably going to need is somebody to help me with my finances, maybe a CFO. Um, at some point, after that, maybe a chief technology officer would be great. Then a chief medical officer, and then a chief regulatory officer. Like, is there an and then, or is that highly dependent?
I would say that there's probably, if you're in the business of drug development, you probably need somebody to underpins the technology. From what I've seen, either the company's founded by the technology, whether it's been insourced, there's a champion behind the technology. But they could be a business person or a scientific person. So yes, I think begins with the technology, and it should be coupled with a business person, which could be the CEO. And if the CEO is a scientific person, you might want to pair them with somebody with a business orientation. But I think initially, the most important thing is does the dog hunt? Does the technology work, and what's the plausibility for that? What's the hypothesis, and what needs to be done to support that hypothesis? And so it really depends where you are in the journey of the drug candidate, or if you're preclinical, where are you in terms of nominating a candidate? So I think there's different aspects to it, but you're absolutely right. I think the foundational leadership evolves in stages, bring in the credibility and expertise is needed. And again, I think it speaks to why a fractional approach could make sense, again, depending on where you are in your evolution. I think, again, it comes back to focus on the product development plan. I can't emphasize enough the importance of nailing down a product development plan with meaningful milestones that guide the financing strategy and the leadership build out. I would also call out the need to pay attention to medical affairs early on. Successful companies really do pay attention to this early on, cultivating meaningful relationships with the investigators and the clinicians. It's really important. It helps on so many different levels. It helps drive patient accrual. Also, on a financing side, investors don't necessarily always want to talk to the SAB. They want to talk to people that are viewed to be much more objective and independent. So, the medical affairs side of the house, even if you don't have a chief medical officer, it's still something that you want to be paying attention to early on. And moving on, I think the timing of key hires is always a consideration. I think, again, it follows the development plan. But from what I've observed, and, I've noticed that CFOs are typically the last C-suite hire that's often brought on board before an IPO, kind of akin to Ringo Starr joining the Beatles before they went on tour. But with that said, I think getting a controller on board earlier on, as I mentioned before, to establish the internal control policies and procedures is a good practice. Because, I remember when I was many times over the course of my career that, if the steam room isn't working, I had no business being on the Lido deck. So, you need to make sure that your back office is fine, that you can safeguard your assets, particularly your cash, that you got controls over procurement, and that, particularly during the clinical trial, the CROs aren't so great at it. So you do want to be able to be upfront and negotiate contracts that that are, I mean, they're always going to be favoring the CROs, but there are efforts that you can do to level set those. And again, not people aren't necessarily aware of the business side, as the name of this podcast, it's the business of biotech. And sometimes people get lost in the weeds.
You mentioned the chief financial officer is often brought on last in advance of an IPO, which seems like perhaps a strategic move. But have you noticed over the course of your career any trends around executive leadership positions that are most commonly ignored or brought on too late? Maybe not ignored, but brought on too late. Is there a problem area, a trend, a trend in terms of the problem area in executive leadership appointment in biotech, or not? Maybe people make mistakes all over the continuum.
It's a fair question to ask. I would say, it's really about getting to the right answers and being informed in a timely manner. And I think it really comes down to how you source that. And I do think people are late on the draw. I think on the regulatory side, I've seen people, take that for granted and not necessarily cultivate the FDA as they should and interact with them like they should. So, I think, regulatory side, and again, it depends on the company. I've seen companies make bad decisions on hiring the wrong chief medical officer, thinking they needed to hire a chief medical officer. And rather than getting the right one, they just lowered the bar and got who they can get. And sometimes it's a factor of the company and, not get who you want. But so I could say, yeah, definitely time, like going back to time being the enemy, there are decisions that sometimes are made too late. A lot of companies will bring a CFO in late, but they don't have the benefit of having advice along the way and they make bad decisions along the way. Yeah. So, I think it's really depends, but I think there's instances all over the spectrum where you either are bringing in people late and making bad decisions prior to that. And I think, unfortunately, there's a situation where you just bring in the wrong person. And then that's also really costly and can set an organization back. And we're not even talking about culture and the other implications.
Yeah. Yeah, bringing in the wrong person. That's a great segue to my next question, because I'm seeing some conflict in some of the words that I hear Allan Shaw talk about. So I want you to straighten me out here on these, right? Like on one hand, there's the old, Allan Shaw standby that in God we trust, and all others must bring data. Love that. And then there's the old Allan Shaw saw that says investors bet on jockeys, not horses. So like in my mind, in my very simple Pennsylvania boy mind, right? There's friction there. There's some conflict, I should say, around companies that maybe aren't data ready, so they just have to trust in God because they're not data ready, but they feel a need to spend money on leadership horsepower because investors bet on jockeys, not horses. Walk me through that. Like how do we resolve that conflict?
Nah, you got me dead in center.
Well, I don't mean to call you out, buddy. You're my friend. I'm not going to call you out.
No, it's a balancing act. It really is.
Me, I'm always looking for black and white responses, and I know everything's gray here. I get that. I know that.
And sadly, I've learned when I worked abroad that people perceive that there's many different shades of gray as well. You're absolutely right. Track records are crucial, especially when investors aim to mitigate the inherent risks of the sector, such as industrial jeopardies and binary outcomes. And betting on someone who's done it before, who has much less in way of blind spots, if any, who is much more secure and not making fearful decisions, but making decisions based on their experiences and facts and circumstances. There's a lot to be said for that. It's really the question of how you do pace, right? I think, the CEO, you want to set the tone at the top, and a good CEO will attract the resources that needs, and a good CEO will know the resources that are required and the most cost-effective way to source them. And we'll build an advisory group and get the input on things that need input on. So there's no getting around that. But I think it's really the pace of how you build that out and how you source the rest of the organization. But there's no question about it that past experience is a good predictor for future performance. No question. And management is a great differentiator. Given the numerous factors beyond the company's direct control, capital markets, scientific developments, regulatory hurdles, competition, reimbursement challenges, the quality of a management team becomes the key differentiator in determining success, particularly in turbulent times. So I stand by that in every which way. Mm-hmm. My only point is pace, and a good management team can usually, more times not, generate the financial backing to execute and put a team. And again, I think coming back to time, if you're properly capitalized and you've got a robust development plan, then you need an organization around that. But I still stand by the fact that it's development plan and your development activities that drive the pace of your organizational development.
Yep. Very good. All right. You cleared that up for me. There's no more friction. No more friction.
I'm glad that we're able to harmonize those concepts.